welcome very much. Welcome everyone to this very special Ctrl Network event. So I can see already a lot of members here today, but for those who aren't familiar with us, we are the Contemporary Theoretical Network. Basically, we kind of like to get together and talk about contemporary theory and philosophy, culture, art, technology, fiction. We started out a few years ago as a pretty small reading group at the University of Birmingham. It was just four of us, myself, Niall, Ben and Arzu. And when the first lockdown hit, like most people, we really wanted to connect with others to talk about not just what was happening, but also during a time of such large upheaval and uncertainty, have a chance to discuss ideas and the thinkers who really inspired us to imagine how things could be different. And needless to say, Mark Fisher was a really central part of that conversation. And our guest speaker today is someone who has inspired us to continue that dialogue. And we're really delighted to welcome back Matt Colquohoun. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with Matt's work on Fisher. His first book, Egress on Melancholy, Mourning, and Mark Fisher, was the first of its kind to explore the legacy and work of Fisher. And back in May, when we first, last year this was, when we first took ourselves online and sort of subsequently relaunched ourselves as Ctrl Network, Matt's book was an absolutely huge influence on our K-Punk Quarantine series, which was a 5-week event exploring the works and texts and ideas of Fisher. Matt was really kind enough to speak with us then, and I know many here will have seen his excellent guest lecture, and we also still have a recording of that available, so I'd definitely recommend checking it out. Matt's blog, Gothic, has been a real staple read for many of us, and no doubt most of you will be familiar with Matt's countless other projects, including his podcast, Bodies Without Organs, which explores the work of Deleuze and Guattari. We at Ctrl Network have also recently finished a 6-part reading group tackling Matt's latest book, which is Post-Capitalist Desire, and the final lecture transcripts of Mark Fisher. Needless to say, this unfinished lecture series raised many questions and inspired a lot of discussion about the place of desire in post-capitalism and the project of group consciousness raising. We're really hoping that Matt is actually going to release another book soon, so it's going to give us something else to talk about. We're very excited to hear Matt's lecture today on a brief history of the new, and as we've mentioned, there will be some time for questions at the end, which we really look forward to hearing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Matt.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. That's such a lovely intro. Yeah, it's really lovely to be back chatting with you all. I guess I was planning to do something a bit different today, at least for me, a bit out of my comfort zone maybe, because I think the last time I was here, sort of saying just before we went live that it's almost a year since I was sort of last talking to the Ctrl Network. And what I read out loud back then was the sort of a draft introduction to the Post-Capitalist Desire lectures, kind of working on that at the time. And it's kind of weird to think that that was nearly a year ago. But since then, I guess I've kind of been starting a bunch of new research projects as far as a new book from me is concerned. I'm hoping it'll be sooner rather than later, but it's a bit daunting to do something that's not going to be about Mark Fisher. Because I think both of these projects have been, both Egress and Post-Capitalist Desire, kind of emerged from the year of Mark's death in 2017. And I guess I'm in a similar boat to maybe many of you, that kind of having read through those sort of final lectures, there's a lot there. I mean, they're fundamentally unfinished, and so there's so many threads left to explore. One of the threads that I kind of picked up that I'm trying to work into a book project is about accelerationism, which maybe quite provocatively now Mark sort of acknowledges as being sort of the biggest influence, like thinking around accelerationism being the biggest influence for that initial course. But I think most people that hear the word accelerationism now, if they're familiar with it, don't think too highly of it, or even maybe know what a lot of its major claims are. And that's probably including a lot of people that identify as accelerationists online. So I'm kind of interested to see what that kind of project would look like now, what an accelerationist project, whether just that's politically or just as a book project, what that kind of what shape that could take. And I think the main thing for me that is integral to the Post-Capitalist Desire lectures and accelerationism as it kind of initially emerged is this question of the new. What is the new fundamentally, and how do we kind of bring it about? And so I thought what I've sort of started doing is, for people maybe that are more familiar with writing on accelerationism in the sort of blogosphere of the last few years, there was quite a famous post by Vincent Garton on his website, the cyclonotrope, or was it the cyclonograph? Apologies. And Vince wrote this, I think it was when he was finishing his own PhD in 2017, and it was called "Excavating the Origins of Accelerationism," and it was quite influential. Vince kind of makes this really interesting point that it's kind of an impossible thing to give a history of. At one level, accelerationism is 10 years old, or was at the time. Now it's a bit older, maybe nearly like 15 years old. But at the same time, the sensation that it's describing is kind of as old as thought itself in a lot of ways. Depending on where you start and where you stop, you'll get these wildly different results. And I think I know that Edmund Burge has kind of done a similar project of looking at accelerationism in the 20th century. Maybe with Vince, I'm sure that Vince's posts kind of in Ed's mind, and it's been in my mind too, but I've maybe gone a bit too far back. But I think in kind of an interesting way, and what I kind of want to talk about, at least now, or at least for this maybe first hour, is a little bit about maybe Greek philosophy, which I'd never really read before, sort of the ancient texts from that area. I should say we call it Greek philosophy. I guess it's a bit more broader than that. They don't necessarily follow the same national boundaries that we do today. But the question of what is the new, the question of how things happen fundamentally is technically one of the oldest questions philosophy's ever asked. And so the past few months I've been kind of considering, well, if you go back that far, what have the Greeks got to say? And how do current questions around the new actually differ? If we're going to talk about the new across a time span that crosses about 2,500 years, it starts to make the new seem a bit weird. And certainly it becomes kind of something to think about. It's difficult to think about in linear terms, which is also quite interesting, I think. So I'm going to read sort of a draft that I have about the Greeks, and then I'm going to read you a second draft that I have a bit more about accelerationism and where it's at today. And hopefully, though they're kind of it's not the cohesive piece of writing that I sort of presented last time, I'm hoping as a kind of work in progress, it might poke at some questions that people already have from reading Post-Capitalist Desire lectures. And maybe there's a chance we can have a discussion about what the new means. Because I guess a final point before I actually start and read something is I know that in recent months this has been a topic that's kind of fled up online again. I had a really interesting discussion with Matt Blumink, who writes over at Blue Labyrinths about hauntology. It was around the time that Sophie unfortunately passed away, and there was a lot of discussion around the kind of future shock of her music and its newness. But also there was a kind of debate between people trying to think about these questions quite sincerely, and there's a lot of sort of music fans that kind of maybe have a more periodized impression of how the new comes about. And I think so it's relevant to those questions too. So I think in some ways this is going to feel totally anachronistic to talk about the Greeks in terms of post-capitalism, but also I think maybe there'll be some resonance with a lot of other topics that people have been discussing, and so hopefully all of this sort of wraps up together. So I'll start with and both these drafts are quite short, by the way, so hopefully it won't be me rambling on too much. But okay, this is a sort of chapter draft for this book that's called A Brief History of the New. How do things happen, and how can we distinguish something new from the mere repetition of something that has already occurred? These are among the oldest questions philosophy has ever entertained. We have records of conflicting answers and lively debates going back over 2 millennia, and that's without considering the various answers put forth by the world religions. Nevertheless, it is a set of questions that remains wholly relevant to our age, in just about every field of knowledge our species is invested in. Science alone seems to have retained a sense of the new. When we discover something we did not previously know, or prove something that was previously only speculated to be true, the world comes together in its awe. But do we share the same experience in the arts? In the postmodern era, we are routinely told that there's nothing more to say, and that the best artists either borrow or steal. Our new technologies too seem beholden to old fantasies. Even our images of the future are supposedly derivative of older forms. But this understanding of the nature of our world is not new either. Though we frequently discuss our own derivativeness with a certain pessimism, this view of the universe was once a utopian orientation. Something has changed. In fact, a lot has changed. Perhaps by ascertaining where we've been, we can better appreciate the peculiar nature, I should say, of now. So first, let us consider the pre-Socratic philosophers, conversing in what is now Greece, Italy, and Turkey. They saw nature as the infinitely productive source of all things. Anaximander, for instance, and I'm going to have to apologize in advance for butchering any pronunciations. Anaximander, for instance, in the early 5th century BC, claimed that a certain nature, the limitless, is the principle of the things which exist. The limitless for him was the infinite potential of all matter. All that is produced from that which already is. The world springs forth from matter and time in its infinitude, with the latter in particular containing, quote, all the cause of the generation and destruction of the universe. For Anaximander, the universe is unified in its limitlessness. Though such an explanation sounds generic and perhaps a little mystical, these are the first attempts to rigorize our understanding of the productive nature of the universe. And it wasn't long before this wholesome view was complicated by another. After all, things do not just begin, things end. Even if all that ends must begin somewhere, and even if ends themselves constitute new beginnings. To say that everything emerges from the infinite is a bit of a cop-out. So surely we are capable of describing the dynamics of nature, its ebbs and flows, its generations and destructions in more detail than that. Heraclitus, born a generation after Anaximander, was perhaps the most famous pre-Socratic philosopher to challenge such philosophies of infinitude. He famously argued, for instance, that we cannot step into the same river twice. There is not infinite unity, only pure difference. Now, this hypothetical river was not simply reflective of Heraclitus's philosophy of nature, but epitomized his view of knowledge and experience in themselves. Many of his aphorisms are truly poetic in this regard, as if even a sentence, though its contents do not change, changes every time we read it. It's an aesthetic sensibility that led him to become known by various nicknames, such as Heraclitus the Obscure and Heraclitus the Riddler. Heraclitus was also similarly intrigued by what he called the unity of opposites. Contradiction in the universe is inevitable, he argues. Hippolytus reports that for Heraclitus, the universe is divisible and indivisible, generated and ungenerated, mortal and immortal. He seemed to enjoy producing such contradictions for himself, and particularly making arguments that were contrary to the intuitions of his contemporaries. For example, unlike Anaximander's contemporary, Anaximenes, who believed that air is the infinite substance from which everything comes into being, Heraclitus believed that fire, in all of its destructive potential, is instead the source of all matter. And why not? Is the suggestion that fire produces all things any less likely than the suggestion that all things appear out of thin air? Either way, for Heraclitus, change is absolute, and therefore so is the new. Everything is new in every instance we encounter it. A few decades after this peak, after the peak of Heraclitus's fame, Parmenides refutes his riddles. He saw the being of all things as ungenerated and indestructible, whole, of one kind and unwavering and complete. Therefore, it's not change that is absolute, but rather the absolute that is always changing. But if nature is in universal flux, then it must have no beginning. It is not new. Everything always already is. Though things may change in their appearance and contradictions may occur, the world is nonetheless whole. Its plurality always adds up to one. And any attempt to divide it is to begin the fool's errand of dividing up the infinite. Now, I think we take this thought for granted today in our photographic age. Though wholly anachronistic, technological progress is still defined in this way. High definition film, for instance, progresses by dividing up time into ever finer measurements. Jean-Luc Godard once quipped that cinema is truth at 24 frames per second. But today we can play video games at 60 frames per second. So does that make them more true? Similarly, we talk about digital televisions capable of displaying 40K resolution. A single image is 40,000, my numbers are awful today. A single image is 4,000 pixels in diameter. Parmenides kind of makes a point that we may not consider today. Such technological improvements are infinite. Life can always be divided up into more and more frames, more and more pixels. Physics, more generally speaking, has its own problems in this regard, since we can now divide matter itself, not just time, into ever smaller particles. For Parmenides, there's only one conclusion. According to Porphyry, another name I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, Parmenides argues that what exists is one thing only, and moreover, that it is partless and indivisible. For if it is divisible, he says, suppose that it has been cut in two, and then each of its parts in two. Since this goes on forever, it is clear, he says, that either some final magnitudes will remain that are minimal and atomic and limitless in number, so that the whole thing will be constituted from minimal items limitless in number, or else it will disappear and be dissolved into nothing, and so be constituted from nothing. So for Parmenides, nothingness is an impossibility, or it is at the very least impossible for us to think. Whereas all cultures have pondered the beginnings of the universe in some capacity, to begin suggests to start moving following an instance of stasis, or indeed of nothingness. And if that's true, Parmenides asks, what need would have impelled it later or earlier to spring up, as if it began from nothing? Creation ex nihilo is a paradoxical phase change. Thus, Parmenides argues, nature must altogether be or not be. And if nothing cannot be, it is all continuous. Unmoving in the limits of great change, it is beginningless and ceaseless. Now, alongside Parmenides, we find Zeno. Zeno was his companion, his lover, and in many respects, his philosophical attack dog. Though his works often focused on humiliating and discrediting Parmenides' critics, Zeno's famous paradoxes nonetheless approach Parmenides' thought from a critical foundation, taking up the arguments of his critics and giving them the benefit of the doubt, if only to then follow them through to some ludicrous conclusion. Consider, for example, Zeno's version of the river of Heraclitus. What is moving moves neither in place. No, I'll read that again. It's a tongue twister. What is moving moves neither in the place in which it is, nor in the place in which it is not, which is what Diogenes claimed he once said. Though not a direct attack on Heraclitus, it certainly echoes his river riddle. It also appears to be a nonsense statement parodying Heraclitus' obscurantism, and it achieves this in an interesting way. To say that all is flux and all is change is, as far as Zeno is concerned, to say nothing. It is both without meaning and suggests that nature itself is formless. But this is still not to say that we should divide nature up into smaller increments. To track the movement of an arrow, as Zeno does in one of his famous paradoxes, is always to arrest the movement we are hoping to describe. To say that an arrow moving from point 1 to point 2 passes by way of point 1.5 is only to stop the flight and begin dividing up the infinite space between those 2 points. Still, Zeno can appreciate the impulse. The implicit point being made is perhaps that everything moves relative to our own position. To return to Heraclitus' river, we might suggest via Zeno that the river only changes in our encounter with it. The river at time 1 and time 2. So we have no way of accounting for the change that occurs when we're not there. As such, our understanding of the river is limited to the fixed perspective of a single observer. And it's Heraclitus who becomes a form within the formless, who signifies as a kind of self the temporary amongst the infinite. But how can we possibly comment on the limitlessness of the universe from such a limited perspective? To step into a constantly moving river is only to stand still relative to the water around you. So would the river still be changing from our perspective if we surfed it all the way to the sea? And when we reach the sea, would we still perceive the river as an ever-changing flow, or as a fragment of the ocean as a whole? For Zeno, this is a dichotomy. His argument suggests that you can't have it both ways. Either everything is changing or nothing is. Ultimately, he decides with Parmenides, movement is impossible, there is only unity. Though the suggestion that movement is impossible seems ridiculous, Parmenides' point is perhaps that we must try and consider the whole and not be blinkered by our own prejudices and limited perspectives. It is, in a sense, an attempt to provide an objective view of reality rather than a subjective one. Though the subject is more readily available, we must commit ourselves to this less readily available truth. Look at things which, though absent, are yet present firmly in thought, he says. So this perspective would prove influential. Indeed, this appeal to rigorous appraisals of the world, both empirical and speculative, would birth philosophy as we know it, as an attempt to develop a science of being and all that it encompasses. In his Republic, we find Plato banning all poets from his city, in his attempts to stay true to this principle. This isn't because Plato hates poetry. On the contrary, he acknowledges that many of the greatest thinkers have been poets. But poets only seek to distract us from the path towards truth, he argues. As such, Plato sees riddlers and obscurantists, like Heraclitus, as a threat to the stability of the world order, quite literally. Poets threaten how we order the world, and it's the job of the philosopher to establish and maintain that order. This order is closely related to Plato's theory of forms. Following his critique of the poets, Plato suggests that the philosopher's job of ordering the senses begins when they posit each form as a single item, relating in each case to a polarity of things to which we attach the same name as we do the form. Plato uses the example of tables. To speak of tables in their plurality is nonetheless to imagine the most generic example of that form as a single item. But we also know at the same time that there is no one table. There are a great many tables, even infinite tables. But all tables nonetheless refer back to a shared and singular idea, or what Plato calls the form of tableness. And it's this idea unchanging that precisely allows for individual variants to be made. Because even though two tables can look wholly alike, and craftspeople can produce new tables and new innovative designs of table, all tables nonetheless exist together under the central idea of what a table is. Now, in this way, Plato finds a middle ground between Parmenides and Heraclitus. After all, we can say the same about Heraclitus's river. We're able to say that the river and the ocean it leads to share an essence, which is water. And we can understand that this shared essence, while at the same time recognizing the distinctive characteristics that necessitate a river and an ocean being referred to by two different names. Even if we speak of different oceans and different rivers, and further differentiate between streams and canals and lakes and pools, to order things within the universe is essential to us. Otherwise, how could we have language? How would we be able to converse with one another? And that's of central importance to Plato, conversation being the primary form that his philosophy takes, with many of his works presented to us as a dialogue between one or more philosophers. So there is difference, and naming difference is how we give form to the new and even new ideas. Now it's downstream from here, from this Platonic river of forms, that we find the great ocean of philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead is famous for having said that the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. But this isn't to diminish 1,000 years of thought that have followed since Plato's own, as if it's all derivative in the pejorative sense. It's instead to understand philosophy and indeed thought itself in a Platonic manner. So Whitehead's comment is, in this sense, reflexive. The form of Plato's ideas, nothing less than a theory of ideas themselves, provided a structure from which all ideas since could emerge. He provides us with an idea of philosophy against which we can judge all of the variants. He gives us philosophiness, to which we all, a sense that we all share, that allows us to proliferate different variants of philosophy. And in that way, we find ourselves connected across millennia, because like the water that connects the river to the ocean, Plato sought truth, and so do we. And yet, if there is such a thing as truth, and we know there is, because 2 + 2 will always equal 4, for example, then how do we account for all that's changed in the meantime? If truths don't change, then how do we keep discovering new ones? And are we even discovering the new if truths are things that have always been true, but were previously unknown? So our understanding of the new no longer seems so linear. Indeed, we might note that Plato's argument is not wholly original in itself. Philosophical positions very similar to his theory of forms were already circulating in other parts of the world at that time. We can find alternative articulations of all the philosophical positions so far described here in countries and cultures all over the world, with each having developed in apparent isolation to the others. Confucius, for instance, whose thought predates Plato's by about a century, developed his own theory of forms. His reification of names, as it's called, is worth noting because it perhaps clarifies why Plato's theory is so important to his republic, that he would ban all poets from the city in its name. Contrary to first impressions, Plato's not a joyless authoritarian, but rather seeks to build a utopia based on the true order of things. He hopes to live first and foremost in accordance with nature and natural law, an attractive proposition, since to do so would negate all the pretensions of ideology. Similarly, Confucius suggests that all social disorder can be traced back to an inability to give things their proper names. The theory of forms then takes on a social dimension. To name each thing in its proper place, not just tables, but emotions and experiences, is to be able to articulate oneself in accordance with nature. When names are not rectified, what is said will not seem reasonable, Confucius writes. When what is said does not seem reasonable, nothing will get accomplished. The political dimension of the new now comes to the fore. I'll stop. That's kind of the end of that draft as it is at the moment. But hopefully, I think what is the reason for reading that and the reason for talking for 20 minutes about the Greeks, if that may seem odd to people that have just turned up, as I think that what the reasons that Plato and the Pre-Socratics more generally agonize so much about giving proper names to things in order to establish either what has already been there, what this distinction between wholeness and difference, between difference and repetition, you might say, is sort of it's a philosophical foundation, and that's something that is kind of it has did re-emerge quite explicitly in the 20th century. To talk about difference and repetition being the title of Deleuze's book, is also talk about being and time, to talk about process and reality, to talk about being an event, to talk about what are the others. I mean, there's, it's as if that's. I was saying this to someone yesterday that being in time is basically the best name for a book on philosophy ever, because whether the book itself is great is kind of besides the point, but because so many people wish they'd picked that title first, that they had to go with variants, which in itself is interesting when you have this understanding of what those different variants mean. What is it to read being in time, process and reality, that being Whitehead's book, difference and repetition, and being an event being Badiou's book all together? How do they all conform to philosophiness whilst all at the same time all being variants of each other? And I guess the important point here, for me, at least in my research, is that difference and repetition, Deleuze's book, and being an event, Bourdieu's book, are kind of the two variants of philosophy in the 20th century that face off against each other for accelerationism. And maybe to kind of articulate a bit more about why that's important, I'll read another short draft that's kind of introducing this project that I'm working on at the moment about accelerationism. What's important about recognizing it as a new name for something, why such a new name is necessary, because new names aren't always necessary. But I guess it's a question of what is new that requires a new name as such. What separates the accelerationism in the present of 2008 and even in the present of 2021? That word needs to exist and be talked about rather than something else. So here's something else that, yeah, on topic of something else, here's something else that I've written recently that kind of this explicitly grew out of the Post-Capitalist Desire lectures, trying to maybe clarify why Fisher is interested in accelerationism and why it's influencing his own, I guess, his own use of a phrase like acid communism. What is new about acid communism that differentiates it from a repetition of communism as such? What does the acid modifier do to make it new, rather than just fetishize a kind of hippie psychedelia of the 70s? All of those questions are kind of baked in here. So maybe I'll read this and then maybe we'll have a chance to a bit more of a discussion. That might even take us up to an hour. I probably hope not, because I feel like I've been talking for a while, but I mean, that's kind of why we're here. Sorry. This is why I read text usually while I do these things, because I have a tendency to ramble. So I will read this and then maybe we can have some questions. So, and I should probably say that this is a draft preface to a book. So I'm going to talk about a book that doesn't exist yet, but hopefully you can go along with me on this. This is a preface to an as yet untitled project. This book is about accelerationism. Chances are, if you've heard that term before, you don't think too highly of it, and even fewer people seem to know what its claims are. And that's including many of those who self-identify as accelerationists. For the blissfully unaware, accelerationism is a promiscuous term. Its meaning has changed considerably since it first came into use among a gathering of bloggers in the late 2000s. At that time, it was a contentious and emergent school of thought concerned with the ways that the inner workings of capitalism are continually speeding up, despite the apparent slowdown of that culturally accelerative phenomenon previously known as modernism. It was an attempt to consider what effect this continuing accelerationism is having on human subjectivity and society more generally, despite the postmodern disparity between economic and cultural velocities. It was also a mode of thought concerned with intensifying certain aspects of capitalism, specifically the anti-capitalist sentiments that capitalism can and indeed must produce within itself to ensure the illusion of progress, even if it must always later obstruct the full manifestation of those sentiments to ensure its own survival. Accelerationism considers then how we might be able to sidestep capitalist de-intensification for the sakes of new and notably post-capitalist political aims. In the late 2010s, however, accelerationism became associated with the most reactionary tendencies in contemporary society, and better known as a half-baked terroristic strategy championed in the manifestos of white supremacists and on the websites of the far-right's online agitators. Among this crowd, accelerationism is viewed as a way to accelerate, that is, exacerbate conflict, contradiction, and other points of social tension in order to provoke capitalism's protocols for self-preservation into action. Far-right accelerationists then want to exacerbate capitalism's fault lines in order to strengthen capitalism sooner rather than later, forestalling the further ascendancy of a woke capitalism and its tendency to kowtow to progressive values. Now, for many, these two accelerationisms are wholly discontinuous and fundamentally opposed to one another. For others, they nonetheless share key influences that cannot be ignored. As a result of this split, accelerationist discourses have since devolved into an unending back and forth between those understandably concerned about the rise of the far right, the rise of far right reactionary movements across the West, and those who wish to salvage some radical and progressive kernel from accelerationism's rotting remains. But no matter who wins, accelerationism loses. It's become a dead horse flogged incessantly by critics and adherents alike. For a movement supposedly dedicated to an acceleration away from stasis, it has embarrassingly beaten itself to death with its own riding crop, and is now stuck in a mess of its own making. Now, this as yet untitled book project hopes to undertake a difficult but appropriately contradictory task: to explore the emergence, subsequent development, and ultimate demise of the term accelerationism. Though a project that will no doubt provoke some alarm, this book's intentions are twofold. First, we'll explore how this strange concept and the myriad philosophies attached to it have developed over the last 2 decades in an attempt to dispel certain myths and misunderstandings that have dogged this philosophy since its inception. Second, we'll attempt to clarify accelerationism's claims about the future, but also, and perhaps more importantly, its continuing implications for our present. To understand the implications of accelerationism in this manner is neither an attempt to salvage it for one last outing or chisel a commiserating epigraph on its tombstone, but instead to understand the mutations that occurred between its niche emergence and its popular disavowal. Why? Because many other terms and ideological positions have fallen victim to this mutative process in recent years also. Consider, for example, postmodernism. Philosophers such as Jean-Francois Lyotard and Frederick Jameson first seized upon this literary term in the last quarter of the 20th century to diagnose the capitalist capture of modernism's make it new imperative. In short, postmodernism was their attempt, was their term. My words are all over this place today. In short, postmodernism was their term for capitalism's reduction of our political commitments to inconsequential commodities. Your political agency and capacity to change the world are neutralized, but this new design of fridge freezer will revolutionize your kitchen. In more recent years, however, reactionaries such as Jordan Peterson have turned this critique on its head, decrying Marxists as the real postmodernists, who've undermined our belief in the truth of capitalism. The promotion of political alternatives to capitalist hegemony amounts to nothing more than cultural relativism, they insist, which has produced successive generations of maladjusted and increasingly discontented citizens. Ergo, it is the critics who are at fault rather than capitalism itself. Maybe as a side note, it's worth saying that, no, I was going to quote Peterson, but we can do without him. Accelerationism has suffered a similar fate to postmodernism. However, whereas critiques of postmodernism still have their defenders, accelerationism has very few. Whereas its first theorists hope to find a way out of leftist impotency and a postmodern melancholy by newly engaging with the specific character of the present, those who retain an interest in its implications today are denounced as pseudo-intellectuals and online edgelords, though not always without evidence. For both adherents and detractors, understanding of the term is poor, but this in itself is telling. Accelerationism in just a single decade was transformed from a new political conversation entertained by radical academics and Marxist theorists to little more than a badge of identification for curious teens browsing the latest online ideologies. Its demise is postmodernism in action, reducing political agency to inconsequential commodity. And it is precisely for this reason that the inexplicable shift in popular understandings of accelerationism, to me at least, remains interesting. Whereas the postmodern, both as global situation and far-reaching critique hangs on, our decades-long preoccupation with it is arguably Whereas the postmodern both as global situation and far-reaching critique hangs on, our decades-long preoccupation with it arguably being a symptom of the very stasis it hopes to describe. This mythical, hypothetical book will argue that the relative microcosm of the accelerationist debate allows us to engage with the present with far more precision than other well-established theories and schools of thought are able. Indeed, whereas our thinking about postmodernismo for almost a century, whereas we've been thinking about postmodernismo for almost a century, being that Spanish literary critic Federico de Onis is said to have coined the term in 1934 to name that conservative reflux within modernism itself. Accelerationism was thrown on the theoretical trash heap before it was even old enough to drink. So in many ways, this early death only emboldens its validity, whereas postmodernism was arguably nothing more than modernism's contradictory historical consciousness coming home to roost, because modernists were always obsessed with a compulsion to keep up. So wrote Northrop Frye in 1967, but were nonetheless reduced to despair by the readily increasing speed of the total movement. The story of accelerationism interrupts the continuation of 20th century disorientation, providing us with a new sense of urgency and revealing just how fast we're really going. But accelerationism nonetheless retains a strange relationship to its predecessors, but the speed with which it emerged and atrophies helps re-problematize the modernist imperative that it otherwise hopes to re-establish, insisting that we also make it new, whilst at the same time questioning what the new really is. Did the bloggers of the 2000s unnecessarily conjure up a new name for a familiar feeling, when innumerable critiques from the history of philosophy, postmodernism most recently, could have still sufficed? Then what is it that makes accelerationism itself new, rather than the repetition of something that's already occurred? And what was it about this uneasy newness that perhaps accelerated its demise? Now, it's no coincidence that the term accelerationism emerged from what Alain Badiou has recently called the crisis of the new, the emergence of which will, that's a note to me, sorry. What constitutes the new as such has been a concern of philosophy for millennia, as we've kind of already discussed. But following the financial crash of 2008, when capitalism's capacity to produce recurrent crises was abjectly called into question by both governments and citizens around the world, this question acquired a new resonance. What was it in that moment specifically that stopped a new post-capitalist world emerging? And if that constellation of events were to repeat itself, as many predict they inevitably will, we could even argue we're living through that at the moment. This strange confluence of events that have defined the past year for us here in the COVID pandemic. How are we supposed to act differently to ensure that real change is able to occur when these sets of events kind of come together? Because I guess that's there's plenty to say that the new happens and things change. We're living in unprecedented times, but how can we struggle to act differently is another question that I think accelerationism explicitly hopes to answer. Is it that we can't keep up with the speed of things till we be able to change our own habits because we're quite stubborn creatures, supposedly? Anyway, there's considerable irony here. Returning to our opening definition of accelerationism, if we are to understand accelerationism as a philosophical thought interested in the intensification of capitalism's self-undermining forces, which capitalism cannot help but produce for itself, we might argue that accelerationism has done much the same thing to its own cause. It has produced unforeseen forces that have undermined its own trajectory. Whilst many of its initial theorizers were explicit in the precise elements of capitalism they hoped to intensify, they failed to control the processual intensification of their own collective thinking. But such a contradiction does not signal the end of this philosophy's usefulness. One of the founding principles of accelerationist thought, after all, is that nothing has ever died of its contradictions, capitalism in particular. And accelerationism itself is no exception to this rule. This claim regarding contradictions originates in Anti-Oedipus, the 1972 book written collaboratively by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. In their wide-ranging analysis of desire under capitalism, they introduce a notion that has stalked political philosophy ever since. The death of a, this is a quote, the death of a social machine has never been heralded by a disharmony or a dysfunction. On the contrary, social machines make a habit of feeding on the contradictions they give rise to, on the crises they provoke, on the anxieties they engender, and on the infernal operations they regenerate. Deleuze and Guattari hold capitalism firmly in their sights, but the rise and fall of accelerationism demonstrates that critiques of capitalism are by no means immune to this insight either. Indeed, we might say that accelerationism's demise functions as a proof of concept. The point this philosophy hoped to make is proven by its own downfall. That is, the entropic spread of information under postmodernism is a major obstacle in building any mass political movement that hopes to work against capitalism as the dominant socio-economic system governing our lives. Now, this is potentially all a bit introductory. To go from the Greeks to the past couple of years in the blogosphere is quite a jump. But I think what as an introduction to a project that I'm currently working on, and maybe some questions that which maybe resonates with some questions that some of you have. What I hope is that by drawing out this process anew, this fundamental process to philosophy of how the new is generated, and how, with Badiou, I guess, especially drawing on Plato, considering that gulf, but also that resonance, what has changed and what is specific about our present, both culturally, politically, philosophically. Yeah, what's new? I guess that's it. What's new? What's new? And to actually answer that question, I guess is kind of, it's recognizing that is not an easy question to answer and never has been. But if we kind of recognize the complexity of that question, we might be better prepared to actually welcome the new in, going forwards. So I guess what the project that I'm working on now hopes to do is to draw out this process anew and reveal how the contradictory nature of a far left and far right accelerationism might yet provoke new thought in our present era. The question for us becomes, how can we remain vigilant to this process of rhetorical decay and nonetheless find new modes of attack? As Deleuze famously wrote elsewhere, it's not a question of worrying or hoping for the best, but of finding new weapons. Once upon a time, accelerationism was one such weapon, but it's been blunted beyond all usefulness, arguably. Nevertheless, it's perhaps only after we've answered that deceptively simple question, what happened, that we'll be able to approach the considerably more complex question of what happens next. That again is kind of the end of this second little draft I have, but maybe that's kind of an interesting point to re-emphasize. It's only after we've answered that deceptively simple question, what happens, that we're able to approach the considerably more complex question of what happens next. And I think I didn't intend this to be the case when I wrote that down, but I think that that's essentially a core part of Mark Fisher's accelerationist project, but also his acid communism project. What does it say for Mark to talk about the present whilst going back to the 70s? What is it to say? What is it for any of us to talk about the new, whilst sort of being also sort of taking a new interest in the old? What is it for me to talk about the new in the 21st century, whilst talking to you for half an hour about the Greeks and Plato and Heraclitus? But I guess that's the point that Mark wanted to make quite explicitly for left politics in particular. So only by being able to answer what happened, only by making that kind of question, which maybe notably is important for Deleuze and Guattari too. They've got a really interesting, they call in 1,000 Plateaus, they talk about the ungivable what happened, which is kind of, I guess, something that they draw on when talking about murder mysteries. And I know that Robin Mackay actually has given a lot in talking about yarn work, the connecting of dots, the innately sort of investigative, the detective work that's necessitated by research. The ungivable what happened is kind of what we have to strive for if we're going to have to, if we have any possibility of answering the question of what happens next. On that note, maybe that there's time for a break in there, and hopefully that's resonant with some of the questions that people have asked or has been brought to people in reading the lectures. I know that the reading group did discuss my introduction last week, so I'm happy to answer questions on that too, wholly unrelated to this. But hopefully that's been resonant and maybe unpacks a few extra things about, at least for me, where my sort of research has gone after reading, not just reading, but putting together those transcripts. So yeah, thanks for listening.